Adventures, get your pancakes ready. Let's go!
Okay.
Curious George makes maple syrup. George loved mornings in the country. Sunday was his favorite morning of all because Sunday was pancake day. Today, the man with a yellow hat was teaching George how to make pancakes. When they start to get bubbly, it means they're ready to flip, his friend said. George flipped each pancake as it was ready. 1, 2, 3. George started pouring a lot of syrup on his pancakes. Go easy on that maple syrup, George. It doesn't grow in trees, the man said. Then he thought for a moment and said, well, in a way it does. George was confused. He imagined picking bottles of syrup off the trees like apples. The man explained that the syrup doesn't actually grow on the trees. It comes from inside the trees. All you have to do is tap them. George had poured all the maple syrup on his pancakes. Now there was no syrup left for his friend, but George had an idea. There were plenty of trees outside. All he had to do was tap them. George put on his coat and went outside. There were many trees on the Rankinses farm. He tapped on each tree like he was knocking on a door. George's friends, Allie and Mr. Rankins, came over to see what he was doing. George, why are you knocking on that tree? Asked Allie. George showed them the syrup bottle. Are you looking for syrup? Mr. Rankins asked. First, you've got to tap the tree to get its sap, Mr. Rankins explained. That doesn't mean knock on it. You have to hammer the tap into the tree. Then you collect the sap in a bucket, like this, Mr. Rankins demonstrated. Mr. Rankins had an extra bucket to spare, so George and Allie could collect their own sap. George was excited. He could cover mountains of pancakes with a whole bucket of syrup. Mr. Rankins explained that to find a maple tree, you have to know the characteristics to look for. Maple trees have gray bark with deep ridges, and they grow their own special leaves. The leaves have 5 points, just like on the bottle of the syrup. After Mr. Rankins showed them how to tap a maple tree, George and Allie were ready to tap on their own. But finding the right tree wasn't easy. After spotting one that had gray bark with deep ridges and 5-pointed leaves, they knew they had found the right kind of tree. The sap dripped and dripped. George and Allie waited, and they waited. They must have tapped the slowest tree on the farm. Finally, George's bucket was full. Now they just needed to make more pancakes. Back at the house, Allie and George surprised their friend with a pancake breakfast and their new syrup. When the man poured the syrup on his pancakes, it didn't taste like maple syrup at all. What had gone wrong? They went back to Mr. Rankins for answers. He explained that the sap becomes syrup only after it's boiled down. Luckily, he could help them boil the sap into syrup at the sugar shack. It takes a while to boil, but if you leave it too long, it can bubble over and burn, Mr. Rankins warned. I'm going to check on the cows. You two keep an eye on the sap. George and Allie watched the sap and waited for it to boil. Mr. Rankins was right. It was taking a very long time. They were getting tired. Suddenly, the sap started to boil over. George tried to fan the sap with pancakes to cool it down. But the butter on the pancakes slipped into the pan. The butter smoothed out the sap and kept it from boiling over. Mr. Rankins returned and said that butter had stopped the sap from burning. Now it had finally turned into syrup. With the help of Allie and Mr. Rankins, George had made a bottle of his very own maple syrup. The next Sunday, George made pancakes for his friend and poured his homemade syrup on them. Thanks, George, says the man. This is the best Sunday morning syrup I've ever had.
Mm-hmm. Did you know maple syrup came straight from the tree? Bye, adventures!